the question comes from students in Bangladesh and Russia who are saying, okay, we are young people who care about our local environments, but we're in different political situations. And the Open Society Foundation's one of the things that distinguishes it is it works where it is allowed to work around the world, even in liberal and authoritarian countries. And I wonder, what advice can one give to people who live in those circumstances about how they can engage to hope for a better future?
I uh, I'm I hesitate to give them any advice whatsoever, Jonathan. You know, too often when one is involved in this kind of conversation and you're at the front of the room, there's an instinct to give the impression that you've got an answer for every query, and that there's a direction that you can hand down that's been enshrined on tablet. I approach that question with a tremendous amount of humility, because despite the journey of my family through oppression and dictatorship, despite my own journey as a Black man in America, which is not quite a democracy for all, I hesitate to give advice, guidance to those who are living in spaces that are nearly, utterly, and completely closed off, seemingly, to change and towards democratic inclusion, in spaces where civil society finds itself not just spaces where they have difficulty operating, but spaces where they are brutally, violently repressed. What I will say is, even in those spaces, we've seen seismic change, and some of us have been fortunate enough to experience that seismic change within our lifetimes as a consequence of very, very, very modest and small contributions that we were able to make. Any one of your students who scrolled through my Twitter feed at all would have seen last week that I was celebrating a personal anniversary that was part of a larger, significant historic moment. I posted some photographs of myself as somebody with a little bit more hair 30 years ago last week, where as a young activist, I had the extraordinary blessing, privilege to be one of the coordinators for Nelson Mandela's first historic trip overseas to the United States after he had been released from 27 years of confinement for fighting for the basic fundamental rights of the Black majority in South Africa. And it was extraordinary for me to look at those photographs, to consider that moment 30 years ago and what it represented, not just in my life, but in the life of the world. I came to my political consciousness, not just as somebody in the African diaspora, specifically born of the Congo and of Haitian descent, but as a result of what occurred in South Africa and the actions that were taken by young people in one of the most closed off, most brutal societies that we've known. In 1976, when I was 9 years old, I get emotional just thinking about it now. 76, 9 years old, I see the footage from South Africa, and my father explains to me that young students in a township called Soweto had put themselves, their bodies, their friction on the gears of the machine in South Africa to say that they were going to be the generation that was going to stop the brutalization of their people and that would work towards emancipation of the Black majority in South Africa. And these young people gave the last full measure of themselves, were willing to die for their freedom. My father helped me to understand that it wasn't likely that they would see that change and that transformation in that moment, and it might take decades, it might take several generations for that change to occur, but the contribution that they were making in that moment would, no doubt, he had no doubt whatsoever that it would eventually lead to change. It's also a time, Jonathan, that, and to your students who are asking this question from those tough spaces, also a moment when I learned the power of diplomacy. In that same moment, someone who I revered at the time, Andrew Young, who had been one of the lieutenants of Dr. King, was selected by President Jimmy Carter to become the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And I saw in his spirited advocacy that took on bad actors in the world, but also took on the policies of his own government at home, his own government that he thought was on the wrong side of history. I saw the possibility of using the gears of government, the gears of spaces where people who look like me were not always welcomed or invited, to use them as leverage to extend solidarity and to build change. So as a result of all of that, I came to understand that even in the spaces where your students are, the contributions that they're able to make, that we are able to make as the Open Society Foundation, the civil society actors in those spaces make today, slowly but surely open the window to allow more oxygen into the room, to allow more transparency into the room, and to spur on the boldness of others. I've gone on too long in response to that, Jonathan, but there's a powerful moment in that dark space of South Africa that I think speaks to the question that your students are asking, and speaks to my sense of how one person can make a contribution and change. In 1965, Robert Kennedy, clearly after his brother, the president, had been assassinated, as he was trying to make his way in the world again, visited South Africa during apartheid. He defied the apartheid regime, defied the American authorities, and went and visited with Chief Albert Ntuli in South Africa, who was a Nobel Prize winner, somebody who was in home confinement and was eventually lost his life. Kennedy went and visited with him, and then he went and visited with students in South Africa at the University of Cape Town. And one of the students said to Robert Kennedy, "We're in a, you come from the United States of America. You have every opportunity to exercise free speech. You have every opportunity to use your privilege and your resources to work for rights. Here, if we speak out, we'll be jailed, we'll be exiled, we could lose our lives. What are we to do?" And it was there in that exchange with those students that Robert Kennedy delivered a set of remarks to them that famously became known as his Ripples of Hope speech. And Robert Kennedy told those students that each time one of them, or each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against an injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And joining each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples become a current that can sweep over the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. So your students who are in Russia, who are in these other spaces, are making a contribution with their scholarship, will make a contribution with their activism that will serve as ripples of hope, that will bring down walls like the apartheid wall, walls like the Berlin Wall, or walls like the walls that exist in minds